The Gender War is not about gender. An essay by Daniel Curtis. Part 1. The Paradox of Cultural Integration. India's Hijras have existed for over 4,000 years. Recognized in ancient Hindu texts as a third gender, they traditionally held ritual roles, blessing newborns and newlyweds, embodying the divine power that transcends binary categories. Neither entirely male nor female, they exist in a liminal space that South Asian culture has long acknowledged, if not always embraced. Today's reality is harsh. Hijras face discrimination, poverty, and violence. Many of them are forced into begging or sex work after being rejected by families and barred from conventional employment. The 2014 Indian Supreme Court ruling granting them legal recognition as a third gender hasn't erased centuries of marginalization. By any measure, they experience real oppression. Yet they haven't become the center of a civilizational culture war. No political parties rise or fall based on their treatment. No one builds entire media empires around defending or attacking their existence. Their presence doesn't divide families at dinner tables or destroy decade-old friendships. They're neither progressive heroes destroying the patriarchy, nor delusional victims of social contagion. They exist, marginalized but not weaponized, oppressed but not politicized, othered but not centered in a battle for reality itself. This distinction matters. The Hijras suffer from age-old human cruelty toward difference, the unfortunately universal tendency to fear and harm the other. But the West has created something unprecedented. We've transformed gender variance from a matter of human difference into an existential battlefield where the entire structure of civilization appears at stake. These are two fundamentally different phenomena, one psychological and local, the other metaphysical and systemic. Part 2. The Western Epidemic. Clinical gender dysphoria rates in Western nations have increased dramatically over the past decade, with some clinics reporting increases of over 1,000%, particularly among adolescents. The UK's Tavistock Clinic reported a 3,264% increase in referrals over 10 years, with similar explosions across North America and Europe. These numbers reflect multiple factors, including increased awareness, diagnostic availability, reduced stigma, and social contagion effects. But even accounting for these variables, something unprecedented is happening. Meanwhile, in India and China, comprising nearly 40% of humanity, reported rates remain at historical baselines. This disparity isn't about homosexuality or gender variance, which exist universally, but about the specific phenomenon of medicalized gender identity crisis as primary psychological suffering, the transformation of gender variance into civilizational crisis. What makes the West uniquely susceptible? Part 3. The Twin Diseases. The West suffers from two interrelated metaphysical pathologies that create perfect conditions for transforming human variation into an existential threat. First, we've severed ourselves from embodied wisdom, what I call the Cancer of Eros. This metaphysical cancer isn't abstract philosophy, but a concrete disconnection from the body's direct knowing. Where traditional cultures recognize gender variance through embodied ritual, dance, or community acknowledgement, we require medical diagnosis, psychiatric evaluation, and expert intervention. The body's inherent wisdom and capacity to hold paradox, to know without categorizing, is replaced with ideology, whether traditional or progressive. Every difference demands a theory, a position, a side. We've lost the capacity to know through being. Second, we exhibit a pathological inability to hold paradox, the cancer of integration. This societal pathology manifests as our compulsion to split everything into opposing camps that cannot coexist. We cannot hold both and. Everything must be either or. Traditional or revolutionary. Male or female. Oppressor or oppressed. Right or wrong. This splitting isn't simply an intellectual limitation. It's a metaphysical catastrophe. When you cannot hold opposites within yourself, you must project that split onto the external world, creating enemies to carry what you cannot integrate. Together, these pathologies ensure that gender variance, which has long existed, becomes a crisis requiring everyone to choose sides, perform positions, and defend territories. Part 4. The dissection of wholeness. When we analyze a hand, we see first flesh and function. Look closer. Muscles, tendons, bones. Closer still. Cells, molecules, atoms. Each level of analysis pushes the components further apart until we've explained everything about the hand except what makes it a hand, its wholeness, its capacity to caress or create. We've mapped every particle but lost the poetry. This concretization is precisely what we've done to gender. In our desperate need to understand, categorize, and control, we've dissected human experience into ever smaller components: chromosomes, hormones, brain structures, social constructs, until we can no longer see the whole person. Both sides engage in this deadly analysis. Traditionalists reducing everything to biological parts, progressives to social fragments. Neither can see that their very method of looking creates the fragmentation they're trying to solve. Part 5. The progressive shadow. Consider how this manifests on the progressive side. Someone feels the suffocating pressure of binary existence. This person accurately senses something more profound, more fluid than rigid categories. This recognition that gender is partially performative and culturally constructed contains genuine wisdom. However, the split then occurs. Instead of integrating masculine and feminine principles internally, doing the psychological work of holding both energies within consciousness, the resolution is projected outward. New pronouns proliferate, categories multiply, identities accumulate. Each attempts to solve externally what remains divided internally. The person who cannot hold their own paradoxical nature demands that society restructure itself to accommodate their unintegrated projections. Language itself becomes the primary battlefield. The proliferation of pronouns isn't merely about respect or recognition. It's an attempt to encode linguistically what we cannot psychologically integrate. Each new term tries to capture in words what remains unsynthesized in consciousness. We're creating an ever-expanding vocabulary for our disconnection, mistaking linguistic precision for psychological wholeness. This analysis isn't dismissing those who genuinely exist outside of traditional categories. Gender variance is real, always exists as a human potential, and deserves recognition and respect. However, the Western explosion includes many who use external category multiplication to avoid the difficult work of internal integration. When you cannot hold paradox within yourself, you must perform it through social identity. Part 6. The conservative shadow. The traditionalist response is equally external and equally avoidant. Faced with challenges to the gender binary, conservatives don't examine why this threatens them so profoundly. Instead, they rigidify, demanding more rules, more enforcement, more desperate insistence that the binary is not just descriptive, but sacred and inviolable. They're correct that something sacred is at risk. Not the gender binary itself, but their entire framework for organizing reality through splitting. If male-female isn't absolute, what other categories might dissolve? If this fundamental division proves fluid, what happens to all the other binaries upon which their worldview depends? Good, evil, order, chaos, civilization, barbarism, all threatened by the dissolution of the primary split. The conservative insistence on binary pronouns is equally symptomatic of the progressive proliferation, using language as fortification against the fluidity they cannot internally accept. Both sides weaponize words because neither can hold the wordless paradox within themselves. Part 7. The Shadow Dance. The left embodies what I call the enabling anima, the shadow feminine that compulsively protects rather than genuinely nurtures. This act isn't authentic compassion, but shadow projection. They see in every gender-diverse person their own integrated wound around identity and acceptance. Their militant protection of infinite identities masks their own inability to achieve an integrated identity. The ferocity of their defense reveals the depth of their own inner split. The right embodies the hollow cynics, the shadow masculine that performs through strength to mask its own fragility. Their desperate enforcement of order reveals a profound fear of chaos. They see in gender fluidity the chaos they've spent their lives keeping at bay through rigid categorization. Their insistence on binary absolutism masks terror at their own internal multiplicity. The violence of their rejection reveals the intensity of their own inner conflict. Part 8. Asymmetric harm, symmetric disease. Here I must address the inevitable critique. This is both sides-ism that ignores real power dynamics and harm. The harms are not equivalent. Trans people face murder, suicide, employment discrimination, and family rejection at devastating rates. Traditional people may lose social capital or face professional consequences, but rarely their lives. The violence flows asymmetrically, and we must acknowledge this reality. But recognizing asymmetric harm doesn't negate the deeper diagnosis. Both responses emerge from the same metaphysical wound. A person dying of cancer in the liver and another with cancer in the lungs don't have identical symptoms or prognosis, but they share an underlying disease. The left's compulsive validation and the right's violent rejection are different symptoms of the same pathology, the inability to hold paradox internally. Moreover, focusing only on surface harms while ignoring the deeper diseases guarantees perpetual conflict. Each side uses the other's excess to justify its own extremism. Each martyrdom deepens the split. The cycle perpetuates because we're treating symptoms while ignoring the disease itself. Part 9. The perfect storm. The West's unique susceptibility stems from specific cultural conditions that transform difference into crisis. Our hyper-individualism transforms identity into a personal brand, requiring constant performance and validation. Where traditional cultures provide identity through community role and ancestral connection, we must construct ourselves from scratch, making every aspect of identity both urgent and fragile. The collapse of communal meaning structures, religion, civic organizations, and extended families leaves individuals scrambling for a sense of belonging. Gender identity becomes one of the few remaining tribes, defended with religious fervor, because it provides what religion once did: meaning, community, purpose. Social media creates platforms where identity performance becomes the primary social currency. Every human variation becomes content. Every difference becomes discourse. The algorithm rewards extreme positions, punishes nuance, and makes the moderate invisible. We've severed ourselves from embodied wisdom that might provide grounding. Without bodies that know, we need experts to tell us what we are. Without a ritual to hold paradox, we need politics to perform it. Without initiation to mark transitions, we need medical intervention to create them. Most crucially, we've lost the capacity to hold paradox, to let opposites coexist without resolution. Instead, everything must be solved, answered, categorized, and side taken. The possibility of peaceful coexistence becomes not just difficult, but conceptually impossible. When you reduce human experience to pure material, chromosomes, genitals, or pure social construction, infinite identities, you destroy meaning itself. The young people experiencing gender dysphoria are responding to this meaning vacuum. They sense that neither pure biology nor pure social construction captures their lived experience. But those are the only languages we offer them. Part 10. The Hijra Mirror. Now, return to the Hijras. They demonstrate what cultural integration looks like. Not perfect acceptance, but stable acknowledgement. They exist within society without requiring total reorganization around their existence. They're simultaneously inside and outside, sacred and profane, accepted and other. The culture doesn't need them to be one thing or another. They're allowed to be both and neither. Crucially, their oppression remains at the human scale. The tragic but comprehensible cruelty towards difference. It doesn't metastasize into a civilizational crisis because the culture, for all its flaws, maintains some capacity to hold paradox. The average Indian doesn't experience the Hijra as an existential threat to reality itself. The West cannot achieve even this imperfect integration. We cannot simply have gender-variant people existing. They must be either brave heroes, destroying oppressive binaries, or delusional victims of social contagion. Every existence becomes a political statement. Every pronoun becomes a loyalty test. Every bathroom becomes a battlefield. Part 11. The performance of transcendence. Both sides perform transcendence rather than achieving it. Progressives perform it through infinite multiplication. If we create enough categories, enough pronouns, enough identities, surely we'll capture the ineffable. Conservatives perform it through absolute reduction. If we enforce the binary strictly enough, surely we'll restore the sacred order. However, the transcendence of binaries occurs internally first, then expresses naturally without force or performance. The person who genuinely integrated masculine and feminine principles doesn't need to perform this integration through pronouns, flags, or rigid roles. They exist in their own wholeness, threatening no one because they need nothing from others to maintain their integration. This transcendence isn't about returning to traditional gender roles or embracing an infinite number of genders. It's about doing the internal work that makes external performance unnecessary. When you've integrated your own opposites, you don't need society to validate your transcendence. When you're whole within yourself, others' expressions don't threaten your stability. What would integration look like? The right would acknowledge their terror of chaos and fluidity, the shadow they've projected onto everything that won't stay in its assigned box. Their projection of all change as an existential threat, the inability to distinguish evolution from destruction. Their use of biology and nature to avoid examining their own rigidity and fear. That their desperate grasp on tradition reveals not strength, but profound anxiety about their own inner multiplicity. The left would acknowledge their addiction to victimhood narratives that provide meaning through opposition. Their performance of compassion over genuine care, protecting others instead of protecting themselves. Their use of inclusion to avoid examining their own exclusions and shadows. That their proliferation of identities reveals not liberation, but profound anxiety about their own inner unity. Both would recognize they're performing different verses of the same song, the song of avoiding internal integration through external performance. Part 12. The Severed Connection. Everything stands on the same disconnected ground, disconnected from the body and its wisdom, disconnected from wholeness and its paradoxes, and disconnected from the simple ability to let things be without making them mean everything. When connected to your own wholeness, others' expressions don't threaten you. When integrated internally, external categories become less urgent. When nourished by real connection rather than performed identity, you don't need validation through political position. The gender crisis is uniquely Western, not because gender variance is Western, but because only the West has created perfect conditions to transform natural human variation into a civilizational crisis. Our combined metaphysical diseases, disconnection from embodied wisdom, and inability to hold paradox ensure that every difference becomes a battlefield. Part 13. The Return of the Repressed. To understand why this explosion happens now, specifically in the West, we must examine what created the pressure in the first place. The rapid onset of gender variance isn't random. It's the predictable result of centuries of extreme patriarchal splitting finally reaching its breaking point. The Western patriarchy created the most extreme version of binary splitting in human history. Other patriarchal cultures maintain some connection to the feminine principle through earth-based spirituality, ancestor veneration, seasonal festivals, or mystery traditions. The West systematically eliminated every trace. The witch trials weren't just about controlling women. They were about destroying the last vestiges of embodied, paradoxical knowing. The mechanization of birth and death, the severance from seasonal cycles, the reduction of nature to resource, all served to create an unprecedented level of masculine principle dominance. We didn't just suppress the feminine. We attempted its complete annihilation. We replaced the wise woman with the medical expert, the intuitive knowing with peer-reviewed studies, the sacred grove with the shopping mall, and the minstrel hut with the psychiatric ward. Every domain where the feminine principle might have survived was colonized, rationalized, monetized, or destroyed. This suppression of the feminine concept created something unique in human history, a civilization operating entirely through a masculine consciousness, characterized by linear, rational, categorical thinking, which splits everything into controllable parts. For a time, this worked. We built empires, conquered nature, mapped the genome, and split the atom. The masculine principle, freed from its balancing opposite, achieved things no civilization had imagined. But you cannot eliminate half of consciousness without consequences. The feminine principle, the capacity to hold paradox, to know through being rather than thinking, to integrate rather than separate, none of it actually disappeared. It was driven underground, into the collective unconscious, where it festered and built pressure. What we're witnessing now isn't the emergence of something new, but the return of something ancient that we thought we'd successfully killed. The young people experiencing gender dysphoria are often the most sensitive to this civilizational wound. They feel in their bodies what the culture refuses to acknowledge in its consciousness, that our binary system is suffocating us. Their dysphoria isn't just personal. It's collective dysphoria manifesting through individual bodies. They're the canaries in our cultural coal mine, gasping for integral air in a split atmosphere. But here's where the tragedy compounds. Because we've so thoroughly destroyed our wisdom traditions, these young people have no framework for understanding what they're experiencing. No elders who've done integration work. No initiation practices to help them hold the paradox. No legitimate paths for embodying both masculine and feminine principles. So they do what any human in distress does. They try to solve the problem with the only tools available. In our culture, Those tools are medical intervention, political identity, and social media performance. The very systems that created the split now offer to solve it through more splitting. You feel wrong in your body? Here's a medical category. You sense something beyond the binary. Here's a political identity. You long for initiation? Here's a TikTok trend. The conservative response of desperately reinforcing the binary only increases the pressure. Every law enacted to enforce gender categories, every insistence that biology is destiny, every attempt to restore traditional values, all of it adds more weight to a structure already cracking under its own rigidity. They're trying to solve the problem of excessive splitting through more confrontational splitting. Two parts of the same tragic play. The progressive response, which breaks down the binary into infinite fragments, releases pressure without healing the wound. Every new gender identity, every novel pronoun, every additional flag. All of it represents an attempt to name what cannot be categorized, to systematize what we must embody, to think our way out of a problem that exists below thought. Both responses make perfect sense within a culture that has only splitting tools. When all you have is the masculine principle, every problem looks like something to be analyzed, categorized, and controlled. Neither side can see that they're using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, or rather, to rebuild it with different floor plans. The eruption was inevitable because you cannot suppress half of human consciousness indefinitely. The West bet everything on the masculine principle, and for many centuries it appeared to be winning. But consciousness seeks wholeness. What we deny returns in shadow form. What we bury alive continues to grow in the dark. The gender crisis isn't creating our civilizational split. It's revealing it. Every trans teenager, every non-binary youth, every child confused about their identity, they're not the problem. They're the symptom of a culture that severed itself from half of human wisdom and expected no consequences. They're bearing in their bodies the weight of centuries of denied paradox, carrying in their confusion our collective refusal to hold opposites. These reasons are why integration isn't just a nice idea or a philosophical position. It's a necessity. It's the only way to heal a wound this deep. The gender variance explosion will continue, and likely accelerate, until we address what's driving it. Not social contagion or liberal ideology, or the breakdown of traditional values, but the original split that created a culture incapable of holding paradox. The young are always the first to manifest collective shadow. They haven't yet learned to suppress what the culture denies. The gender confusion is our confusion made visible. Their identity crisis is our crisis embodied. Their desperate search for categories that fit is our collective acknowledgement that our current categories are no longer effective. Until we do the work of integration, personally and collectively, we're simply rearranging the furniture in a burning house. The fire isn't in gender debates. It's in the split consciousness that makes such debates inevitable. The cure isn't better categories, stronger boundaries, or more inclusive language. It's the return of what we tried to kill. The feminine principle, the capacity for paradox, the ability to hold opposites without resolution. The eruption was inevitable. The question now is whether we'll use this crisis as an opportunity for integration or take the easy path and double down on the splitting that created it. The young people carrying this burden in their bodies deserve better than being pawns in our civilizational shadow work. They deserve elders who've done their own integration, cultures that can hold paradox, and wisdom traditions that honor both principles. The gender crisis is calling us home to wholeness. The question is whether we're ready to answer. Part 14. The Threshold. We stand at a threshold. The gender crisis isn't just another culture war skirmish. It's the fever that will either kill or cure Western civilization. We're witnessing the return of everything we buried, and how we respond will determine whether we evolve or collapse. The cure isn't picking a side, enforcing binaries, or multiplying categories into infinity. It's healing the disconnection itself. The ground that makes every difference into war, every variation into identity crisis, every expression into political statement. But this healing requires something more difficult than political action or social reorganization. It requires each of us to face what we spent centuries avoiding. Integration begins in the body. Not in theory, not in identity, not in political position, but in the actual felt experience of holding opposites. Can you feel both your masculine and feminine energies without needing to choose? Can you sense the part of you that wants order and the part that craves chaos without splitting them into hero and villain? Can you sit with paradox long enough for it to reveal its wisdom, rather than rushing to resolve it through ideology? This work is terrifying because it means surrendering the very mechanism that's organized Western consciousness for millennia. When you truly integrate, you lose the ability to make others carry your shadow. You can no longer project your disowned parts onto the convenient enemies your political tribe provides. You become responsible for your own wholeness. The young people carrying gender dysphoria in their bodies are showing us what we refuse to see, that our entire civilization is dysphoric, uncomfortable in its own skin, unable to inhabit itself honestly. They're not confused. They're responding accurately to a culture that has severed itself from half of human consciousness. Their courage in naming their discomfort, however imperfectly, surpasses our cowardice in maintaining comfortable splits. Every trans teenager wrestling with identity, every parent terrified for their child, every traditionalist watching their world dissolve, every progressive fighting for inclusion, all are participating in the same collective awakening. The forms differ, the suffering varies, but the underlying movement is the same. Consciousness is trying to heal itself through us. But healing requires more than recognition. It demands action at every level. Individually, begin the work of integration. Find practices that reconnect you to embodied knowing. Meditation, dance, breath work, anything that drops you below the splitting mind into the integrating body. Learn to hold paradox in your own being before demanding that others resolve it for you. Relationally, stop making others carry your shadow. The trans person isn't your projection screen for chaos. The conservative isn't your repository for rigidity. Practice seeing in others what you refuse to acknowledge in yourself. Every trigger is a teacher. Every reaction, a revelation about your own splits. Collectively, create spaces for genuine integration. Not safe spaces that protect splits, but brave spaces that facilitate wholeness. Develop new rituals for holding paradox. Build communities that can contain differences without weaponizing them. Support the young with wisdom traditions that honor both principles, rather than ideologies that intensify divisions. Culturally, recognize that the gender war is a proxy for consciousness itself. Every battle over pronouns is really about whether we'll continue organizing reality through splitting. Every fight about bathrooms is actually about whether we can tolerate ambiguity. Every conflict about children's bodies is fundamentally about what kind of consciousness we're creating for the future. These suggestions barely scratch the surface. The real work of integration, how to cultivate embodied wisdom in a disembodied culture, how to build containers strong enough to hold paradox without splitting, how to midwife the return of the feminine principle without triggering civilizational backlash, deserves careful exploration beyond what any single essay can provide. What I've offered here is a diagnosis, not a cure. The first step in healing is recognizing the disease. We've spent so long arguing about symptoms that we've forgotten to examine the underlying pathology. Once we understand that our gender crisis emerges from metaphysical splitting rather than social progress or moral decay, we can begin imagining treatments that don't simply redistribute the disease. That work, the practical alchemy of turning our civilizational lead into gold, must come next. The performance of transcendence, whether through rigid tradition or infinite innovation, is ultimately a symptom of avoiding the real work, internal integration. When enough individuals do this work, the external cultural war doesn't get won, it becomes obsolete. Not because we've found the correct answer, but because we've transcended the wrong question. The theater continues only as long as we agree to perform our assigned roles. But increasing numbers are walking off stage. Not in indifference, but in exhaustion with the script. They're finding each other in the spaces between polarities, discovering that wholeness is more interesting than winning. The Hijras, in their imperfect integration, remind us that cultures can hold paradox without apocalypse. But we're called to something greater than returning to traditional accommodation of difference. We face a choice to birth a new form of consciousness entirely, one that doesn't just tolerate paradox, but thrives on it, doesn't just accept mystery, but dances with it. This concept isn't a utopian fantasy. It's an evolutionary necessity. The same splitting that gave us the power to dominate nature now threatens to destroy us through that domination. The same binary thinking that built our civilization now tears it apart. The same masculine principle that achieved miracles in isolation now creates catastrophes without its balance. The gender crisis is the portal through which this transformation must pass. It's not a coincidence that the issue has become central. It's precision. The wound that seems most divisive contains the medicine for healing. The conflict that appears irreconcilable holds the key to reconciliation. The very thing tearing us apart could be what finally brings us together, not in false unity, but in an integrated wholeness. The young people we're so worried about, whether they're questioning their gender or defending traditional roles, are already living in the collapse of the old paradigm. They're not choosing to be confused. They're accurately perceiving that our categories no longer hold. Our job isn't to force them back into boxes or proliferate new ones, but to do our own integration work so we can offer them something beyond splitting. The question isn't whether gender variance should exist. It always has and always will. The question isn't even whether we'll continue transforming it into a civilizational crisis. We're already past that point. The real question is whether we'll use this crisis as the catalyst for the transformation it's calling forth, or whether we'll ride the splitting all the way down to mutual destruction. The revolution isn't about winning the gender war, but about recognizing it as the birth pang of a new consciousness. Each of us who does the work of integration midwives this birth. Each moment we hold paradox instead of splitting, we build the new world. Each time we choose wholeness over position, we weaken the old paradigm and strengthen what's emerging. The gender crisis is calling us home to wholeness. Not backward to false unity, but forward to integrated complexity. Not to simple answers, but to living questions. Not to perfect resolution, but to dynamic balance. The West created a crisis from human variation by attempting to eliminate paradox. We can only resolve it by becoming the paradox ourselves, masculine and feminine, order and chaos, traditional and revolutionary, all held in the crucible of integrated consciousness. This essay is not a philosophical position. It's the next stage of human evolution, and it's knocking at our door through the bodies of our children. The question is whether we're brave enough to answer.